The faint scent of Earl Grey still lingered as my grandson smirked, calling me too old to think straight from across my own dining table. Still, I kept my hand steady around the teacup, letting its warmth bleed into my skin like memory. As their laughter mixed with the ticking of the antique clock, that citrus and bergamot turned bitter in my throat. While my son looked away and my daughter-in-law stayed silent, I remembered who paid for every inch of this house. The same home they thought they'd inherited was already signed, sealed, and gone. That's when I smiled and let the silence teach them what the law had already decided. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Eleanor Parker sat at the kitchen table, the sunlight creeping through the window in a gentle golden ribbon. It was a quiet moment, the kind she'd come to cherish in her later years, yet today it felt strangely heavy. Her hands, though aging, were steady as they held the cup of tea, its warmth seeping into her skin. She knew what was coming. Jacob's voice pierced the calm like an unexpected storm. "You're too old to think straight." The words didn't sting in the way one might expect. No, Eleanor had long learned to shield herself from the barbs of ignorance. But it was the delivery, the loud, dismissive tone, that made the air feel suddenly dense with tension. He didn't say it to her face. Instead, it was a deliberate proclamation meant to be heard across the room, with Nathan and Lauren right there, nodding in approval. Jacob, with his broad shoulders and cocky smile, had always believed that the world revolved around him. At 22, he was still a boy in many ways, untested, yet convinced of his own superiority. But today, his words were like a slap across the face, not just to Eleanor, but to everything she stood for. Nathan, her son, didn't flinch. His gaze was fixed on his phone screen, seemingly unaware, as usual, of the shifting dynamics. Eleanor's heart tightened just a fraction. How had he come to this? How had he let his son become this arrogant? Lauren, perched on the edge of the chair, didn't say a word. Her eyes flickered briefly toward Eleanor, but there was no defense, no hesitation. The unspoken message was clear. Jacob was their chosen one. She, the matriarch, had become the inconvenience in their eyes, the relic of a time best forgotten. Eleanor took a slow, deliberate sip of tea, her gaze unwavering. She could feel the weight of their expectation pressing in on her. They thought her old age had dulled her mind, that she was simply a figurehead, a leftover from an era they thought irrelevant. What they didn't understand was that Eleanor's mind had never been sharper. The tension in the room was palpable. Jacob, emboldened by his grandparents' silence, leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms smugly. His lips curled into a grin, as if he had won some invisible battle. In his eyes, this moment of mockery was a victory, a declaration that he, the new generation, had triumphed over the past. But Eleanor wasn't defeated. She wasn't shaken. Her phone buzzed. A text from Pat. "Call Victor, we'll turn this around." The words were simple, direct, but Eleanor knew what they meant. Pat had always been her rock, steady and shrewd, and in this moment her friend's faith in her gave Eleanor something more than a spark of hope. It gave her purpose. Eleanor didn't need to respond to the message right away. It was enough to know that Pat understood. And Pat had seen the cracks in Jacob's armor long before this moment. Slowly, Eleanor set the tea down, the porcelain clinking softly against the saucer. She rose to her feet, her movements deliberate, but never hurried. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, the weight of judgment, but there was no place for doubt now. She had a plan that would show them all just how wrong they were about her. She walked toward the wooden desk in the corner of the room where a few old family records were kept. She had long been meticulous about managing her affairs, far more so than anyone ever suspected. Her property, her legacy. She had spent decades making sure it was ironclad. Her fingers traced the edges of the legal documents, the old deeds she'd kept tucked away for a reason. It wasn't just the land that mattered, not really. It was the authority, the control. It was about respect, and reclaiming the power that she knew was hers. The family might have forgotten who held the reins, but Eleanor had never let go. She took a deep breath and reached for the binder that held the property ownership records. She flipped it open, her eyes scanning the pages with practiced ease. There it was. Her name, signed in bold ink, the ownership as clear and unshakable as it had been when the papers were first drawn up. No one could touch it. Not Jacob. Not Nathan. Not even Lauren. Her plan had been set in motion years ago, when she'd sensed the shifts in her family's attitude toward her, the slow erosion of respect, the way they'd dismissed her suggestions, the mocking looks behind her back. At first, it had been small things, a comment here, a glance there. But those things added up, and Eleanor, wise in the ways of the world, knew exactly how to handle it. Victor, the estate attorney, had been on her side from the beginning. Together, they'd crafted a strategy for just such a moment. She would transfer the property, assign it to someone who could and would defend her authority. It was a simple move, legally speaking, but to Jacob, it would be a revelation. Eleanor stood tall, her mind already working through the details. Timing, method, execution. It would all unfold exactly as planned. Jacob would soon learn that she wasn't the fragile old woman he thought she was. She wasn't even close. With a final glance at the document, Eleanor's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. The game had begun. The sound of footsteps approached, but Eleanor didn't flinch. She was ready. And as the door creaked open behind her, she knew they would all soon see who was in charge. The morning sunlight filtered through the heavy curtains of Eleanor's study, casting long shadows across the mahogany desk. It was a quiet, measured kind of morning, just the way Eleanor liked it. The room was filled with books and old family records, the air thick with the scent of history. To any outsider, it would appear as a place where memories and papers gathered dust, but to Eleanor, it was a fortress. The documents she kept within these walls were far from ordinary. They were the keys to her future. Her fingers moved with practiced ease, flicking through the neatly organized folders. It was comforting, in a way, knowing that everything was in its place, that her affairs were in order. But today, the usual sense of calm was tinged with something else, something sharp and purposeful. She had known this day would come. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, letting the leather creak beneath her. The deed to her property, the very one Jacob had dismissed with his careless remark, was in her hands now. Her ownership had always been legally sound, but today she examined it with renewed focus, confirming every detail, every clause. It wasn't just a piece of land. This was her legacy, her control, and, in the most critical sense, her weapon. Her eyes scanned the pages steady and unhurried. She had worked too hard, too long to let some entitled, naive young man assume he could walk all over her. Jacob had no idea what was truly at stake. A sharp buzz from her phone broke her concentration. She didn't hesitate. Pat had sent a message, her words always succinct, always to the point. "We need to move fast. Call Victor. Get it done." Eleanor smiled to herself. Pat had always been the kind of friend who didn't need to say much to convey urgency. She was pragmatic, efficient. But there was also a warmth in the way Pat always stood by her. In their shared history, they'd navigated more than one storm together. Today would be no different. Picking up the phone, Eleanor dialed Victor's number. The estate attorney was someone she trusted implicitly. His legal expertise had been invaluable when she'd started putting her plans in motion all those years ago. The first time she'd felt the shift in her family's attitudes, she'd known something had to change. And Victor was the one who'd helped her chart a course, who had ensured every detail was airtight. Victor answered on the third ring, his voice steady. "Eleanor, I was expecting your call." "I need to move quickly," she said, her voice calm but firm. "We'll need the deed transferred to a trusted party, someone who can protect it from certain individuals." "I'll handle it," he replied without hesitation. "Just give me the name, and I'll prepare everything." Eleanor paused, her mind calculating the best course of action. She had already chosen the person who would stand in her place. Someone capable of asserting the control Eleanor could no longer afford to wield herself. It would be a smooth transition, legally, but emotionally, it would be a different story altogether. "I'll send you the details," Eleanor said, her voice cool, every word measured. "Let's make sure we get this right." As she ended the call, Eleanor's gaze shifted toward the window. Outside, the world carried on as it always did. People walking along the street, cars passing by. It was all so ordinary. And yet, everything was changing. There was no turning back now. Across the city, Pat was taking notes. She was meticulous, the kind of person who never let a detail slip by unnoticed. She'd seen the cracks in Jacob's demeanor for a long time, the way he acted like the house, the land, the family. It all belonged to him. But Pat had been Eleanor's eyes and ears in the background, quietly documenting the growing sense of entitlement in Jacob and his parents. Pat knew this was more than just a property transfer. This was about making a statement. The property wasn't just real estate, it was a symbol. A symbol of Eleanor's authority, her hard-won respect. As Pat worked, Sophie Kim was in her office across town, reviewing the legal instruments that would finalize the deed transfer. Sophie was a quiet force, someone Eleanor had handpicked for her discretion and thoroughness. The bank liaison was meticulous, ensuring everything lined up. Eleanor trusted Sophie to verify the details, to cross-check every clause, every stipulation. She was the final line of defense. By the time the phone rang again, Eleanor was standing by her desk, staring at the clock. Timing was everything. She had already planned the moment of the transfer. It had to be done quickly, without fanfare, without anyone realizing until it was too late. Victor's voice crackled through the line. "All set. The deed transfer will be complete by the end of the day." "Good," Eleanor said, her voice steady. "Now we wait. I'll handle the rest." She hung up and turned her gaze back to the document in front of her. The deed. The legacy. She had always known this day would come, the day when she would need to act decisively, when her authority would be tested. The property they thought was theirs to control, to manipulate. They had no idea who held the true power. As she ran her fingers over the edges of the paper, Eleanor felt a rush of anticipation. The time for planning had passed. The time for action was now. She picked up her phone and typed a quick message to Pat. "It's done. Now, let's see how they react." The last of the morning light flickered across the room as Eleanor stood, taking one last look at the family records before turning toward the door. The game was on. Eleanor sat at the edge of her desk, the evening sun casting a faint amber glow across her study. She hadn't moved since her conversation with Victor hours ago. The deed had been transferred. It was done. Yet there was still something left to do. The final act, in a carefully orchestrated play. Her fingers lightly tapped the edge of the polished wood, lost in thought. Her plan was about more than just securing the land. It was about sending a message, a statement of authority, of control, and, ultimately, of consequence. They would never see it coming. Jacob, with his arrogance, had no idea just how thoroughly she had prepared for this moment. She leaned back in her chair, taking a deep breath. The decision had been made months ago, long before Jacob's disrespect had turned into a public mockery. The person who would take ownership of the property, someone she could trust, was already chosen. Eleanor didn't need to act in haste. She was playing a long game, and patience had always been her greatest ally. Victor had been clear in his advice. The transfer will be legally bulletproof. You've covered all bases. He'd assured her the documents were airtight, and everything was in place. It was the final confirmation she needed. The legal transfer wasn't just a formality. It was the embodiment of her control over her own destiny, no matter how the family reacted. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Pat. Everything in order? Pat's voice was quiet but filled with anticipation. She had been Eleanor's silent partner in this chess game from the beginning, always one step ahead, always observing. Eleanor nodded, her face impassive. Victor confirmed it's all set. The legal details are flawless. Her eyes flickered toward the window, where the city of Portland sprawled out beneath the fading sunlight. Now it's just a matter of timing. Pat remained standing, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She didn't press for more information. She didn't need to. Pat understood the plan better than anyone. Her friend's silence was a comfort, a reminder that, despite their age, they were still sharp, still calculating. Meanwhile, across town, Sophie Kim sat in her office, scrolling through the documents with the precision of someone who had handled thousands of transactions in her career. Sophie had always been diligent. Eleanor trusted her, knowing that the bank liaison would ensure the execution of the deed went smoothly, without a single detail overlooked. Sophie was the final layer of security in a plan that was already airtight. Eleanor could feel the weight of the decision as it settled in her chest. She had worked so long to get to this point, years of building, years of defending what was hers, all leading to this moment. It wasn't just about the land. It was about proving something to Jacob, to Nathan, to Lauren. It was about making sure they understood that there was a power in play that they couldn't touch, couldn't control. Jacob, for all his bluster, was unaware of the depth of Eleanor's strategy. She could almost see him now, walking around with that cocky, dismissive grin, completely oblivious to the walls closing in around him. He thought the world was his, that he could walk in and take what he wanted. But what he didn't understand was that the true power didn't lie in what he could take. It lay in what Eleanor could give away, and more importantly, to whom. Eleanor reached for the phone, tapping out a quick message to Sophie. It's time. Proceed with the transfer. Her finger lingered over the send button. This was the moment she had been waiting for. She pressed it, and the message was sent into the digital ether, a quiet instruction that would set the wheels of her plan in motion. A few seconds later, her phone buzzed with a confirmation from Sophie. The transfer was in process. Eleanor felt a subtle rush of satisfaction. She had always known the importance of timing, how a moment's hesitation could mean the difference between victory and defeat. She had seen so many others stumble because they hadn't understood that. Hadn't understood that power wasn't just about holding on to something. It was about knowing when to let go. Turning back to Pat, Eleanor's gaze hardened, a quiet determination settling in. It's happening. Jacob won't know what hit him. Her voice was calm, but there was a steel edge to it. She wasn't angry. She didn't need to be. She was merely executing the final step in a plan that had been years in the making. Pat's lips twitched upward, a smile forming that was both knowing and conspiratorial. He won't. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world outside continued its ceaseless motion, unaware of the quiet revolution unfolding in the study. But inside, Eleanor felt the anticipation building, the sense that she was on the cusp of something far greater than any of them had imagined. The family would soon realize the truth. They had underestimated her. And once they understood that, there would be no going back. As the minutes ticked by, Eleanor's thoughts remained sharp. This wasn't just a legal transaction. It was a power play, a message wrapped in the cold, unfeeling form of paperwork. Jacob had thought she was too old to think straight. Now, she would show him just how wrong he was. In that final moment before the deed was officially in someone else's hands, Eleanor allowed herself a small smile. The game had already been won. She just hadn't made the final move yet. And when that move came, the shock would be as devastating as it was inevitable. Eleanor stood at the head of the table, the room buzzing with an anxious energy that seemed to crackle in the air. It had started innocently enough. Dinner with the family, a gathering that Nathan had insisted on to smooth things over after the tension of recent weeks. But tonight, it wasn't going to be about making amends. Tonight, Eleanor would make them see. The dining room was softly lit, the heavy oak table set with fine china, but it felt distant, almost too formal for a family gathering. The conversation, light and forced, echoed off the walls, but Eleanor's mind was elsewhere. She wasn't listening to the idle chatter around her. She was calculating, waiting for the right moment. Jacob sat at the far end, his usual arrogance softened by the presence of his parents. His eyes flicked briefly toward Eleanor, as though he hadn't quite figured out what to make of her lately. He was waiting for something. What, exactly, he wasn't sure. But Eleanor knew the power was shifting. The land, the property, her legacy. None of it had ever truly belonged to him, no matter how much he had wanted it. "Mom, I've been thinking about the house," Nathan said, his voice tentative. "Maybe it's time we start making some decisions about what's next. You know, with..." Eleanor held up her hand, the simple gesture halting his words mid-sentence. "I've already made a decision." The room fell silent, and for a brief moment, Eleanor let the weight of her words hang in the air like a thick fog. Everyone's eyes were now on her, but only she knew what was truly happening. She wasn't here to negotiate. She wasn't here to explain herself. The time for that had passed. Jacob leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice a mixture of curiosity and challenge. "Is this some kind of announcement?" "Yes," Eleanor replied coolly. "An announcement." Her hand moved to the envelope beside her, the simple, unassuming envelope that held the deed, the very deed that would alter the course of their family forever. She took it between her fingers, feeling the weight of it, the power of it, and slid it across the table toward Nathan. Nathan's gaze shifted from the envelope to Eleanor's face, and then to Jacob. He was confused, unsure. "What is this?" he asked quietly, his voice betraying a hint of concern. Eleanor smiled, her eyes locked onto Jacob. "This, Nathan, is the deed to the property. It's been transferred." There was a collective pause, a moment where time seemed to slow, where everyone held their breath, unsure of what was happening. Eleanor could feel Jacob's eyes on her, the disbelief creeping across his face. He looked at the envelope, then back at her, his confusion morphing into something else. Something darker. "Transferred?" Jacob finally managed to say, his voice tight. He swallowed as though the words didn't quite make sense. "To who?" Eleanor didn't flinch. She remained calm, poised. "To someone I trust." Victor, standing nearby, stepped forward. His presence was quiet but commanding. "The transfer is legally binding," he confirmed, his voice steady and authoritative. "All documents were executed properly. The transaction is final." Jacob's eyes flickered toward Victor and then to Nathan, who was still processing, still unsure of what exactly had just happened. Eleanor could see the color drain from Nathan's face as he glanced from the deed to the family members gathered around the table. He was stunned, completely caught off guard. Jacob, on the other hand, seemed to be frozen, his mouth slightly agape, his face flushed with disbelief. He had always thought he could control the situation. He had always believed that the property, the family fortune, the power, would eventually be his. But now, as he stared at the envelope, the truth began to sink in. He had been outmaneuvered. Completely. Mom. Nathan's voice cracked, a rare break in his usual composure. What does this mean? Who has the property now? Eleanor turned her gaze to him, her voice calm but cutting through the tension like a sharp blade. It's no longer in the family's hands, Nathan. It's been transferred to someone who can ensure it's protected. Someone who understands its value. Jacob's chair scraped against the floor as he shot to his feet, his frustration palpable. This is insane. You can't just... He stopped, his voice choking off as the realization hit him full force. He had lost. The control he had assumed was his had slipped from his grasp, and there was nothing he could do to get it back. The room was thick with silence. No one spoke. No one moved, as the weight of Eleanor's words sank in. Pat, standing near the door, watched it all with quiet satisfaction. She didn't need to say anything. She knew the shock on their faces said everything that needed to be said. Jacob's eyes darted around the room, but he couldn't find the words. The smugness that had once been so easy for him was gone, replaced by an expression of stunned disbelief. He had been bested, outsmarted by the one person he had underestimated the most, his grandmother, the woman he had mocked, the woman he had thought was too old to think straight. Eleanor allowed herself a small, knowing smile, her eyes never leaving Jacob's face. You wanted control, Jacob, she said, her voice steady, almost too calm. But control isn't about taking what others have. It's about knowing when to hold on and when to let go. The family sat in stunned silence, and Eleanor let them have it. Let them feel the shock, the humiliation. Let them understand what had truly happened here. This wasn't just a legal transfer. It was a rebuke, a reminder that she was still in charge. And no one had the power to take that from her. Outside, the evening sky was turning dark, the last of the sunlight fading away. But in that room, the shadows seemed to grow deeper, as if they were absorbing the realization that, despite their assumptions, Eleanor had been the one pulling the strings all along. Jacob remained frozen, his face an unreadable mask. But Eleanor knew. He understood. The evening had fallen into an oppressive silence, the kind that clung to the walls and seeped into every corner of the room. The dining table, once a place of familial connection, now felt like a courtroom. Eleanor stood at the center of it all, poised as ever, her gaze unwavering. Victor stood at her side, the legal documents in hand, the ink still fresh on the pages. His role was clear. His presence was the final assurance, the undeniable proof that this wasn't a joke, a mistake, or a mere family squabble. This was final. The property had been transferred. It was no longer theirs. Jacob's face had gone pale, his hands gripping the edge of the table as though the earth beneath him might collapse. He couldn't seem to grasp what had just happened, or how it had happened without his knowing. His earlier bravado had vanished entirely, replaced by the frantic searching of a man who had lost his grip on everything he thought he controlled. Lauren sat beside him, her usual sharpness gone. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came. She glanced at her son, her gaze flickering from him to the document and then back to the others. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to break. Some utterance, some explosion of denial or disbelief. But there was nothing, just the soft rustling of papers as Victor held up the deed, confirming its binding nature. Everything is in order. Victor's voice was calm, almost detached, but it carried a weight that seemed to deepen the tension. The transfer is complete, legally sound and irreversible. The property now belongs to a new entity. It is no longer under your control. The last words hung in the air, each one falling like a hammer onto the family's collective consciousness. Jacob, who had been sitting stiffly, his eyes darting between Victor and Eleanor, finally pushed his chair back with a loud scrape. The room seemed to contract around him, but it wasn't just the space that had closed in. It was his world, the one he had so confidently thought he could manipulate. He had always believed he would inherit it all. His sense of entitlement had led him to believe that nothing could stand in his way, and yet, there he was, dispossessed, powerless, his future slipping through his fingers. He opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. What could he say? How could he challenge what had just happened? Eleanor watched him closely, her expression unreadable, but in her eyes there was a quiet satisfaction. She hadn't needed to shout or argue. The reality of the situation was much louder than any words could be. Lauren shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her hands now clasped in her lap, her gaze fixed firmly on the floor. She didn't know how to react. She had spent so long supporting her son, believing his arrogance was justified, but now that arrogance lay in ruins at her feet. She wanted to speak, to argue, but nothing came. There was only silence. Eleanor's calmness in the face of such raw emotion was almost unnerving. She wasn't angry. She wasn't vindictive. She simply understood something that her family hadn't. The true power lay in control, in the subtle manipulation of events over time. She had waited, and now, at last, she had acted. Victor, ever the professional, continued his quiet reassurances, reinforcing the legality of the transfer, explaining in a steady voice how everything had been executed above board. He was meticulous, ensuring that the foundation of what Eleanor had set in motion would hold up under any scrutiny. But it wasn't the legalities that weighed on Jacob and his parents. It was the weight of what they had lost. They had underestimated Eleanor. They had believed her to be a relic, a fading figure. But she had just demonstrated the sharpness of her mind in a way that left them speechless. And then, as if on cue, the first whispers began. A few of the guests, who had been quietly observing the drama unfold with increasing discomfort, exchanged glances. There were murmurs, soft at first, uncertain, but growing louder as the reality of the situation set in. The news had already begun to spread, the ripple effect inevitable. Whispers of the transfer's true significance began to swirl. What had they just witnessed? Was this the end of the family's hold on the property? I didn't know. One of the guests murmured, his voice barely audible. She really did it. Another, more tentative voice followed. Who does she think she is? Pulling something like that. The tension in the room was palpable, and Eleanor could feel the shift. The guests, who had once assumed the family was in control, now sensed the reversal. The power had shifted, and the whispers were already beginning to spiral out of control. Eleanor had planned this. She had anticipated it. And now, the ripple of disbelief was turning into something else. A quiet admiration, perhaps. Or fear. She couldn't tell yet, but she could feel the undertones. She met Victor's eyes, a silent confirmation passing between them. The legal work was done, but the battle for respect and authority was just beginning. Jacob, still standing, had finally found his voice. You can't just do this. His words were frantic now, his control slipping, his earlier arrogance gone. This isn't right. I deserve it. Eleanor's eyes softened, but her voice remained firm. You don't deserve something just because you want it, Jacob. You deserve what you earn, what you prove you're capable of handling, and you've shown me you're not ready for this responsibility. Her words landed with finality. She didn't need to say more. The shock on Jacob's face said everything. He had never been prepared for this, not for the depth of Eleanor's resolve. Pat, standing off to the side, watched it all with quiet satisfaction. She had known how this would unfold. The careful planting of seeds, the meticulous planning. Everything had come together as it should. She had always believed in Eleanor's ability to outwit her family. And now, she would watch as they came to realize just how wrong they had been to underestimate her. As Eleanor turned toward the door, she allowed herself a brief, satisfied smile. The game was far from over, but tonight, she had won. And Jacob had finally learned what it meant to be outsmarted. As the family sat in stunned silence, the whispers grew louder, the tension becoming unbearable. The world had just shifted. And for some, it would never be the same again. The late evening light had long faded, replaced by the cool, silvery glow of moonlight filtering through the curtains of Eleanor's study. She stood by the window, looking out over the sprawling city of Portland, her hands folded calmly in front of her. The events of the night had unfolded exactly as she had planned, but the real work was still ahead. Sophie Kim's office was downtown, nestled in one of the city's sleek glass towers, a far cry from the family estate. But tonight, it felt just as vital. Eleanor had known that the accounts, the property funds, were just as crucial as the deed transfer itself. What had been legally executed in front of family and friends could still be undone if the financial systems were not equally protected. Sophie had already set things in motion, ensuring that everything was locked down, transfers completed, funds reallocated, and the property's assets completely secure. Eleanor trusted her implicitly. Sophie's attention to detail was her greatest asset, her quiet efficiency a perfect complement to Eleanor's strategic mind. The phone rang, pulling Eleanor from her thoughts. It was Sophie. "Everything is secure, Eleanor." Sophie's voice came through, clear and steady. "The property accounts have been moved, and the funds are under the new entity's control. There's no chance Jacob can interfere now. It's all set up with layered protections." Eleanor's lips curved into a small, satisfied smile. "Good. Make sure there's no trail, Sophie. I don't want anyone digging through those records." "You have my word," Sophie replied, calm and professional. "It's all airtight. Nothing to worry about." Eleanor nodded, even though Sophie couldn't see her. "Excellent. Now, just keep an eye on things for the next few weeks. We can't afford any surprises." The line went dead, and Eleanor placed the receiver back in its cradle. She remained standing by the window for a moment longer, letting the soft hum of the city outside seep into her consciousness. It was strange, how peaceful everything felt now. The storm had passed. Her plan had been executed perfectly, and now the real test would begin: maintaining control. She turned back to the room, where Pat had taken a quiet seat in one of the armchairs, her eyes fixed on Eleanor as if waiting for some unspoken cue. Pat had been with Eleanor through thick and thin, an invaluable ally whose quiet support had helped shape the strategy. She'd seen the cracks in the family's unity long before Eleanor had taken action. Tonight, Pat's silent observation said everything. She knew as well as Eleanor did that Jacob and Nathan's world had irrevocably changed. Nathan, still processing everything, had been uncharacteristically quiet. Eleanor could see the subtle shift in his demeanor. He no longer had the easy confidence of a man in charge. He had watched, in real time, as the property slipped from his grasp, and he had realized that he no longer wielded the same authority he had once taken for granted. He hadn't spoken much since the reveal. His eyes flickered nervously between Eleanor and the now empty space where Jacob had stood moments ago. But something in him had changed. Eleanor could see it, just barely, the flicker of doubt. "Mom." Nathan's voice broke the silence, his words careful. "You didn't have to do this. I don't understand why you couldn't have waited a little longer. I'm trying to be the one to fix things. Why didn't you let me?" Eleanor cut him off before he could finish. "You wanted control, Nathan, but you failed to see what was slipping away, right in front of you." Her words were soft, almost too soft, but they hit him with the force of something heavy. He opened his mouth to argue, but the words didn't come. He simply looked down, his hands resting on the table, the weight of his own inadequacy pressing on his chest. Victor, who had been standing silently by the door, watching the entire exchange with a professional detachment, spoke up. "The transfer is permanent," he said, his voice carrying the finality that Eleanor's family needed to hear. "All financial protections are intact. Jacob has no claim. No one does. There's nothing left for them to take." Victor's words were the hammer that sealed the coffin, and the room seemed to shrink again, the weight of reality settling over the family like a thick blanket. Eleanor knew, as she looked at Nathan's stunned face, that he had just learned an important lesson. Sometimes, the thing that slips through your fingers is the one you never thought you'd lose. Jacob's absence in the room spoke volumes. Eleanor hadn't seen him leave, but she knew he couldn't stay. The humiliation was too much for him. He had been upended in a way that shattered his fragile perception of power. And yet, Eleanor didn't feel triumph. She didn't need to gloat. The chessboard had been set in motion long ago, and now everything was simply falling into place. Pat, still observing, leaned forward slightly, her voice low. "He'll be back. They always come back when the truth hits them. But this time, it won't be like before." Eleanor didn't respond immediately. She turned her attention to the door where Nathan still stood, his posture stiff, his mind clearly working through the aftermath of what had just transpired. "Everything you thought you knew has changed, Nathan," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the calm, steady rhythm of a woman who had already seen the end of the story. "You wanted the power, but you couldn't see how to protect it. You still don't know how." Nathan's lips parted, but once again, no words came. His eyes flickered briefly toward Pat, then back to his mother. It was the kind of look that spoke of realization, of a man who was just beginning to understand the weight of his failures. And then, as if to punctuate the moment, the softest sound echoed from the hallway, the creak of a door opening. Eleanor didn't need to look to know who it was. Jacob. The prodigal son returning, no doubt, to try and reclaim something that he had never truly owned. As the sound of footsteps grew louder, Eleanor's lips curled slightly. It wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about making sure that when the final pieces of the puzzle clicked into place, there was nothing left for anyone to claim. Her family would understand soon enough. They had underestimated her, but now, there was no way back. The quiet hum of the evening seemed to stretch endlessly. The family, still reeling from the evening's revelation, sat frozen in place, as if the world outside had ceased to exist. The guests, those who had been invited into the sanctity of this family dinner, were now witnesses to something far beyond their expectations. Eleanor stood by the window, her silhouette framed by the soft moonlight that bathed the room. She could feel the weight of their gazes on her, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she savored the stillness, the calm before the inevitable storm of reactions that was about to unfold. Jacob, still standing, had his face twisted in disbelief. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, and he struggled for control of the words that burned in his throat. But they wouldn't come. His earlier bravado had dissolved, leaving him nothing but a hollow shell of the arrogant young man who thought he could bend the world to his will. Now, standing in the center of the room, he was nothing more than a child whose prize had been taken away, who suddenly saw the world as it truly was, a world in which his entitlement meant nothing. Lauren, sitting beside him, finally broke the silence. Her voice, usually sharp and filled with authority, now faltered. This isn't fair," she said, her words coming out in a desperate gasp. But even she knew how weak they sounded. Her eyes darted from Jacob to Eleanor, and then to the others, but she didn't dare challenge her mother-in-law. The control had shifted so completely in Eleanor's favor that it was impossible to deny. Victor, standing quietly by the door, was the only one who remained unruffled, his expression neutral but assured. He checked his watch once, then took a slow step forward to the table, where the document still lay untouched. The ink was dry. The transaction was official. Rest assured, the legal documents are secure. The transfer is irrevocable, and all measures have been taken to ensure no further claims can be made against it. Eleanor's gaze shifted briefly to Victor, a silent acknowledgement of his role in everything that had transpired. He had been the final piece in the puzzle, ensuring everything was as airtight as it could be. She didn't need to say anything. The confidence in her posture, the calmness of her voice, said it all. Everything had been meticulously handled, and no one, not Jacob, not Nathan, not even Lauren, could undo it. The guests, who had been silent observers up to this point, exchanged glances among themselves. Whispers started to circulate, growing louder with each passing moment. Some of them, who had known Eleanor for years, began to piece things together. The subtle shifts in her demeanor, the quiet authority she exuded. They were starting to understand. The realization hit them in waves, a slow flood of astonishment and awe. One guest, a longtime acquaintance of Nathan's, leaned into another and whispered, "She really did it, didn't she? She's taken control." Completely. Another guest nodded, her eyes wide with disbelief. "I didn't think she had it in her, but now it's obvious." Pat, standing near the door, watched the scene unfold with quiet satisfaction. She didn't need to intervene. The humiliation on Jacob's face was enough. His public embarrassment was unfolding in real time, and she could feel the subtle shift in the air, the growing admiration from the guests who had once seen Eleanor only as the aging matriarch of a family that seemed to be slipping away from her. Jacob, unable to stand any longer in the center of the room, stormed off toward the door, muttering curses under his breath. His footsteps were heavy, the weight of his defeat evident in every step he took. But even his retreat could not erase the damage. The truth had been laid bare for everyone to see. Lauren, who had been so certain of her position, was now lost. She glanced helplessly at Nathan, who had yet to move, his body rigid as he stood by the table. His eyes were fixed on the documents, but his mind was far away, lost in the turmoil of everything he had just lost. Eleanor, still calm and poised, allowed herself a brief glance at Nathan. His confusion, his dawning realization, was almost painful to watch. But she didn't offer comfort. She didn't need to. He was learning what all of them would soon learn, that she had never been as vulnerable as they'd thought. She had simply been waiting for the right moment to act. And now, that moment had come. As Jacob's footsteps faded, Eleanor's lips curved slightly, a quiet smile of quiet mastery. She hadn't needed to make a grand speech, or even raise her voice. The action spoke louder than anything she could have said. The power had shifted. There was no going back for them now. "Do you think they'll try something again?" Pat's voice cut through the stillness, her eyes still fixed on Jacob's retreating figure. Eleanor's smile deepened. "They'll come back, Pat. They always do. But this time, it won't be the same. They'll understand what it means to have underestimated me." A murmur of agreement passed through the room, the whispers growing louder. The guests had started to make their exit, some still clearly shaken by what they had witnessed, others unsure of how to react. But Eleanor knew one thing for sure. Their perception of her had changed forever. Her family's world had shifted, and they would be forever aware that, despite their doubts, Eleanor Parker had outplayed them all. And as the last guest slipped out the door, Eleanor turned back to the table, her eyes meeting Pat's. "Now, we wait. The real game is about to begin." Pat nodded, her expression full of understanding. The final phase was about to unfold. And when it did, Jacob, Nathan and Lauren would finally realize the truth. Eleanor was the one who controlled the board. The silence in the house was a heavy, pressing thing. Too much weight, too much stillness. Even the faint sounds of the city outside seemed to fade into the background, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Eleanor stood by the large oak desk, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of the family documents that still lay neatly arranged before her. Everything had unfolded perfectly, but this was far from over. Victor, who had remained a quiet presence through the aftermath of the night, was now reviewing the papers again, ensuring that every final step had been executed flawlessly. His attention to detail was something Eleanor had long come to rely on, and now, as the minutes ticked by, the knowledge that everything was locked down seemed almost too satisfying. "Everything is secure, Eleanor," Victor said, his voice steady, but there was a subtle note of admiration behind it. "The financial systems are protected. The transfer is permanent. Jacob has no claim. There's nothing left for him to take or disrupt." Eleanor didn't turn to him, but her lips curled into a slight smile. She didn't need to hear it again, but Victor's confirmation was a nice touch. His presence, his unwavering professionalism, had been crucial to her plan. She glanced briefly toward the door. The house felt quieter now, emptier. Jacob had retreated, and Nathan had become a shadow of the man he once was. Lauren had barely spoken after the confrontation, lost in her own thoughts. They were all reeling, and yet, despite their stunned reactions, Eleanor felt no need to revel in the moment. She had already won. The power had shifted, and now it was her turn to act. Pat, ever watchful, was standing near the corner, observing everything with quiet satisfaction. She didn't need to say anything. The look on her face spoke volumes. She had always known how this would unfold. She could see, as Eleanor could, the cracks in the family's foundation growing wider with each passing moment. "Eleanor," Pat spoke softly, her voice laced with a quiet respect. "They're still not going to let go of this, are they? Even now?" Eleanor didn't immediately answer. Instead, she ran her hand along the back of her chair, her gaze drifting to the family estate outside the window. She had thought of every detail, every eventuality. She had known they wouldn't surrender quietly, but that didn't concern her. The real work had already been done. The foundation was set, and now, no one could touch it. "It doesn't matter what they think," Eleanor said finally, her voice calm and assured. "Jacob believes he can interfere. Nathan still thinks he has control, but it's not up to them anymore." Victor, sensing the quiet authority that Eleanor had always commanded, stepped forward and laid down the final stack of documents. "It's all been processed. Everything's locked in place, the account secured. Even if they attempt to challenge it, they won't get past the protections we've put in place." The finality in Victor's tone hung in the air, echoing in the stillness of the room. For a moment, Eleanor allowed herself to simply absorb it. She had done it. The power had shifted, and she was now fully in control, not just of the property, but of everything tied to it. The guests who had remained during the aftermath, too uncomfortable to leave immediately, had started to murmur amongst themselves. Eleanor could hear their voices rising in volume, the weight of the evening's events beginning to settle in. They had seen Jacob, the presumed heir to the estate, crumble in the face of Eleanor's quiet resolve. They had witnessed the shift in authority, the subtle but undeniable way in which Eleanor had reclaimed what was once taken for granted. Her mastery of the situation was undeniable. "I think they finally get it," Pat said, her tone almost amused. She nodded toward the doorway, where a few lingering guests exchanged whispered comments. "They see you now, Eleanor, for what you really are." Eleanor didn't smile in response. There was no need for her to bask in their recognition. She had always known this moment would come. She had waited for it, planned for it, and now she was reaping the benefits. It wasn't about recognition from others. It was about the quiet satisfaction of knowing that everything had been executed precisely as intended. The door to the study creaked open. Nathan, his expression still tight with disbelief, stepped into the room, glancing at Eleanor before his eyes landed on the documents she had just closed. There was a brief, tense silence before he spoke. "Mom, I don't understand how you could—" He stopped himself, realizing the futility of his words. His voice trailed off as he looked down at the papers, the weight of the situation finally sinking in. He had lost, and there was no easy way to explain it, no way to take back what had already been done. Eleanor's gaze met his, her expression calm, unwavering. "You didn't see it, Nathan. You didn't understand what was slipping through your fingers." Her voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it, one that he could no longer ignore. "Now you'll see what happens when you fail to act in time." Victor, who had stepped back slightly, watched the scene unfold with a look of quiet approval. He knew Eleanor better than most. He knew that she wasn't driven by the desire to hurt or humiliate. She was driven by something far more powerful: control. Nathan's shoulders slumped, the weight of his own failure finally catching up to him. He didn't look at Eleanor again, instead walking out of the room without another word. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving only the soft rustling of the papers in the room, the faint hum of electricity, and the quiet certainty of Eleanor's position. Pat glanced at Eleanor, her smile widening just slightly. "You were right all along," she said. "They never stood a chance." Eleanor's lips parted, but no words came. She simply nodded, her eyes distant. She had played the long game, and she had won. As the house grew quieter, as the guests slowly filtered out, and the last of the evening's tension dissipated, Eleanor allowed herself a moment to reflect on what had just unfolded. The power was hers now, and she had secured it with the patience, precision, and strategic mind that her family had so clearly underestimated. The game had been played, and Eleanor had mastered it. The silence that hung in the room after Nathan's departure was thick, suffocating even. But Eleanor had no need for words. The quiet spoke volumes, each passing second a testament to the unspoken shift that had taken place. She didn't seek recognition. But as she stood there, her gaze sweeping the room, she realized something. This wasn't just about the property anymore. This was about power, her power, and the quiet strength that had long been ignored. Victor, standing by the door, looked over the family documents once more, his hands steady. "As I've said," he murmured with a quiet finality, his tone authoritative. "All protections remain intact. The deed transfer is final, and there are no legal avenues left for challenge." His words, precise and clean, carried weight that not even Jacob could deny now. Eleanor didn't need to hear it. She had known from the moment the transfer was completed that the fight was over, but hearing it again, especially from someone as meticulous as Victor, was the final confirmation. There was no going back. Pat, standing just a few feet away, offered Eleanor a small, knowing smile. She had always been the observer, the one who watched as things unfolded. But this time, she allowed herself a moment of quiet celebration. She had known from the start that Eleanor had the strength, the resolve, to reclaim what had been so carelessly threatened. And now, with Jacob gone and Nathan defeated, she could finally see it, the family's facade crumbling away. The guests, who had been uncomfortable witnesses to the unfolding drama, now stood in small groups, murmuring amongst themselves. There was a collective tension in the air as they processed what had just occurred. Eleanor could hear snippets of their hushed conversations, words like control, surprising, didn't see that coming. One of the guests, a longtime friend of the family, leaned over to another, whispering, "I've never seen anything like that. The way she handled it. So calm, so precise." Another guest nodded, a glint of admiration in their eyes. I thought Jacob would inherit it all. But Eleanor, she outplayed them all? It's like she's been in control this whole time, just waiting for the right moment. Eleanor didn't react. She didn't need to. She could feel their eyes on her, feel the recognition settling into the room like dust, filling the space that had once been filled with doubt. The realization had taken root. Eleanor wasn't just a figurehead. She was the heart of this family, and now she was the one who held the power. Jacob, who had made such a spectacle of himself earlier, was now nowhere to be seen. He had retreated in defeat, humiliated, and there was nothing he could do to recover from the blow to his ego. His earlier bravado had been stripped away, and the guests who had once admired him now looked at him with quiet disdain. But Eleanor wasn't concerned with Jacob. She wasn't even concerned with Nathan, who still seemed to be lost in his own thoughts, trying to piece together the shattered remains of his own expectations. No, Eleanor's thoughts were focused on the future, on what came next. Her family had finally seen the truth, but it was the world outside the family that would soon learn it too. The whispers in the room grew louder, more insistent. Some guests were already making plans to leave, but others lingered, caught up in the atmosphere that had shifted so dramatically. They could feel it, the change in the air. Eleanor could feel it too, that subtle shift. As the last few guests slowly began to filter out, their glances lingering on her with newfound respect, Eleanor allowed herself a brief moment to reflect on the intricacies of her plan. It had been patient, calculated, and it had unfolded precisely as she had envisioned. Every small decision had led to this, the final move, the final reveal. The quiet satisfaction of knowing she had played the long game, and now it was her victory to savor. "Pat," Eleanor said softly, breaking the quiet. "It's finally done." Pat nodded, her smile widening ever so slightly. "You've earned this, Eleanor. They'll remember it. You've shown them all." Eleanor's eyes swept over the room one last time, lingering on the empty space where Jacob had stood, his absence almost as telling as his presence had been. "They'll all remember," she said quietly, the weight of her words landing heavily between them. "But not for the reasons they think." The final guest had gone. The house was now eerily quiet, the tension from earlier slowly dissipating into the corners of the room. Eleanor could feel the power in the air, the unspoken recognition of her authority. It wasn't just the family now, it was everyone who had witnessed what had just happened. The way she had maneuvered, outplayed, and finally secured her place. She didn't need their approval, but the admiration was undeniable, and that was the twist she had been waiting for. The world outside would soon understand, just as her family had, that Eleanor Parker had been in control all along. The recognition had begun, and it would spread far beyond this room. The game wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for now, Eleanor allowed herself to enjoy the quiet mastery of it all. The afternoon light streamed through the large windows of Eleanor's home, bathing the room in a warm, golden glow. Outside, the world moved on, indifferent to the monumental shifts that had occurred inside the walls of her family estate. It was quiet, unnervingly so, in fact. But Eleanor found solace in the stillness. The storm had passed, and now there was nothing but the soft hum of her thoughts and the gentle breeze moving the curtains. She sat by the window, a cup of tea in her hands, its warmth a stark contrast to the cold, methodical precision that had defined her recent actions. Everything was secure now. Jacob was gone, his power dissolved, and Nathan was left grappling with the reality of what he had lost. For the first time in a long while, Eleanor allowed herself to truly relax, to savor the peace she had so carefully orchestrated. Victor had left earlier, after ensuring that the final legal filings were in order. his signature on the dotted line sealing the fate of the property and the accounts. Eleanor had known the minute he walked out of the house that the legal protections were permanent. There were no loopholes left, no cracks for anyone to slip through. Everything was set in stone. Even if Jacob returned, even if Nathan found a way to challenge her, there was nothing they could do now. They were powerless. Pat, who had remained at Eleanor's side through the entire process, watched her now from the doorway. She had always been an observer, a silent partner in the games Eleanor played. But today, there was something different in the air, something that even Pat couldn't deny. There was no tension, no uncertainty. The family was broken, and Eleanor was standing in the calm center of it all, her quiet mastery undeniable. Pat stepped into the room, her eyes flickering toward Eleanor with a sense of respect. "It's quiet," she said softly, almost as if speaking to herself. Eleanor glanced at her, the faintest of smiles playing at the corners of her lips. "It's a different kind of quiet," she replied, "the kind that comes after everything has been put in its proper place." Pat gave a slow nod, understanding exactly what Eleanor meant. The family, once so full of noise and expectations, had now become a distant memory, a past that no longer held sway over Eleanor's future. The real work was done. Now it was time to decide what came next. Eleanor took a slow sip of her tea, her eyes lingering on the view outside. The property, once the source of so much tension, now seemed almost irrelevant. What mattered now wasn't ownership, it was control. And Eleanor had that, not just over the land, but over her own destiny. The quiet satisfaction she felt wasn't just from the triumph over Jacob or Nathan, it was from the knowledge that she had outwitted them, strategically, over time. It had never been about the immediate gains. It had always been about long-term vision, and now that vision was clear. The property was hers, the funds protected, and her authority was cemented. There was nothing left to prove. Pat broke the silence again, her voice softer this time. "What now? What's next for you?" Eleanor set her cup down carefully on the table and met Pat's gaze. There was no hesitation in her eyes. "Now, I make sure the next generation understands the lesson. I'll allocate some of the funds to charity, something to secure my legacy, something that will keep my influence alive long after I'm gone." Pat raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Charity?" she asked, clearly impressed. "Not what I expected." Eleanor allowed herself another small smile. "Charity is just another form of control. People remember the things you leave behind. I'll make sure my name is remembered for the right reasons." Pat stood in silence for a moment, taking in Eleanor's words. She had known Eleanor for decades, but in this moment, she could see her with fresh eyes. Eleanor wasn't just a businesswoman. She wasn't just a mother or a grandmother. She was a master strategist. A woman who had thought every move through years in advance, who had played her family like pawns in a game she knew she would win. The doorbell rang suddenly, cutting through the silence. Eleanor's gaze shifted briefly, and she knew who it was without even needing to check. A few of the guests who had lingered longer than they should have were arriving back, no doubt to offer some token of apology or respect. They had seen the shift in the family dynamics. They had witnessed Jacob's defeat, Nathan's disillusionment. They had seen Eleanor's quiet, calculated rise to power. Eleanor took a deep breath, standing from her chair. She didn't need to look at Pat again to know they were both thinking the same thing. The recognition that had started with the family would now spread. People would talk. The whispers of admiration that had started with the guests in the house would find their way out into the wider world, and when they did, Eleanor would be ready. As she crossed the room toward the door, she felt a sense of calm mastery wash over her. The battle had been long, but it was over now. Everything was as it should be. She opened the door to greet the guests, her smile polite, but with the quiet power of a woman who had already secured her place in the world. "Thank you for coming," Eleanor said, her voice smooth and controlled, each word deliberate. "I trust you'll find your way out, but I'm afraid I've already moved on from family business." The guests, already looking at her with quiet awe, nodded in agreement, and Eleanor stepped back, allowing them to file out. As the door clicked shut, she turned to Pat. "Let them talk," she said, a calm satisfaction filling her. "They'll soon realize just how much they underestimated me. I've only just begun." And with that, Eleanor turned away from the door, back into the quiet of the house that was now, undeniably, hers. The sun was setting over Portland, casting long shadows across the empty spaces of Eleanor's home. The windows, once filled with the chaotic energy of her family, were now quiet, the faint hum of distant traffic the only sound in the otherwise still house. Eleanor stood at the window, her eyes narrowed slightly as she reflected on the events of the last few days. The game was won, but the lessons had only just begun. Her family had always been so sure of their entitlement, their place in the world. Jacob, with his brash confidence, had always assumed that the property would eventually fall into his hands, that it was his by right. Lauren, too, had supported him, believing that the family's wealth and status were theirs to inherit, to manipulate. Nathan, for all his passivity, had never questioned it. They had all assumed that Eleanor, despite her sharp mind, was simply too old to hold on to what was rightfully theirs. But none of them understood the true nature of authority, the kind that didn't rely on brute force or loud demands. Eleanor had learned that lesson early. Power wasn't about force. It wasn't about loud voices or even obvious victories. Power was quiet. It was in the long, patient waits. It was in knowing when to step back and when to move forward. Eleanor had watched her family for years, seen their arrogance grow unchecked. They had become so accustomed to getting what they wanted that they believed it would always be that way. They believed they had it all figured out. But Eleanor was different. She didn't need to shout to be heard. She didn't need to claim what was already hers. She knew the value of silence, of patience, of letting others believe they controlled the game until the moment was right. "Everything is secure, Eleanor." Victor's voice broke into her thoughts, the steady tone a reminder that all her work was indeed complete. "The legal protections remain permanent. There are no gaps, no threats to the transfers. Everything is in place for the long haul." Eleanor didn't turn from the window. She didn't need to. She knew Victor's words were as solid as the walls surrounding her. He was as meticulous as ever, and the legal framework she'd set up was unbreakable. The deed, the funds, the property, everything was locked down. It was done. Behind her, Pat stood in the doorway, watching silently. She had been there through it all, an ever-watchful partner in Eleanor's carefully executed plan. Pat didn't need to speak either. She had seen the satisfaction in Eleanor's eyes when Jacob had stormed out, the weight of his failure pressing down on him. She had seen the subtle shift in Nathan's posture, the way his shoulders had slumped after realizing his position was no longer secure. And now, Pat could see the quiet triumph in Eleanor's face, the satisfaction of knowing that the family's arrogance had finally been stripped away. Eleanor turned, finally acknowledging Pat. There was a glint in her eye, a small but knowing smile on her lips. "They still don't understand it, do they? The lesson." Pat's lips twitched upward, but she said nothing. She didn't need to. The answer was clear. Jacob had made a public spectacle of himself. He had thought that throwing his weight around, mocking his grandmother, would force her to bend. But instead, he had been the one who'd been bent. He had been shown, in front of everyone, that his confidence and entitlement meant nothing. It was a bitter pill, but one he needed to swallow. Lauren, too, had been blind to the deeper currents of power. She had supported Jacob without question, thinking her own ambition would see her through. But Eleanor knew her better than that. She knew Lauren's ambition would never match the quiet resolve of someone who had spent years building a foundation, brick by brick. Lauren hadn't earned the right to lead. She had only assumed it. Nathan, though, was perhaps the hardest to face. His passivity had allowed the family to slip into complacency. His reluctance to stand up for what mattered had cost him dearly. He hadn't fought for what he should have. In the end, Nathan had learned that true leadership wasn't about submission or avoidance. It was about taking charge, being decisive, and he hadn't been either. Eleanor took a slow breath, her thoughts returning to the strategy she had carefully laid out. Now, the work begins, she murmured, almost to herself. Pat raised an eyebrow, intrigued. What's next? Eleanor's eyes flickered briefly to the door, where a few guests remained, lingering just outside. The last of the family and friends who had seen the final moments of the confrontation. We'll allocate a portion of the funds to a few key charitable projects, Eleanor said, her voice steady and composed. The right kind of legacy will ensure that my influence lasts beyond this house, beyond this family. Pat nodded, impressed, but said nothing. It was clear that Eleanor's plan was about much more than just securing property. It was about solidifying her position, not only within the family, but also in the wider world. Eleanor had always known that power wasn't just about the here and now. It was about building something lasting, something that would live on long after she was gone. As the guests filed out, many offering their quiet respect, Eleanor stood still in the center of the room. The shift was undeniable. The family might not understand it yet, but the world beyond would soon see her for what she truly was, a master of strategy, a woman whose calm authority would not be easily ignored. As the last of the guests left, Eleanor allowed herself a moment of reflection. They'll learn, she whispered, her eyes resting on the empty space where Jacob had stood. They'll all learn. And with that, she turned away from the door, back into the quiet solitude of the home that now, unquestionably, belonged to her. Eleanor sat in the quiet, sun-drenched study, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup as she gazed out over the sprawling property that had been the center of so much conflict. The tranquility of the moment felt almost surreal, a stillness that followed the storm she had so deftly weathered. The decisions she had made, the actions she had taken, had been calculated down to the last detail. Now, she could finally breathe. The power was hers. But even with everything secured, Eleanor's mind was already moving forward. The game had been won, but it wasn't over. The family, though broken and reeling, had been taught the lesson they had failed to learn. Jacob, Nathan, and Lauren had been outmaneuvered, but there was more to be done. Now, Eleanor's thoughts were on the legacy she would leave behind, something that would last long after the last of her family's pride had been crushed. She stood and moved toward the desk, where the documents lay neatly arranged. She had already transferred the funds, allocated a portion of the estate to charity. An unexpected move that would be both strategic and meaningful. She hadn't needed to make this public yet. The family's gaze was still too fixed on what had just happened, their eyes too focused on their own loss to see the bigger picture. But Eleanor knew that the shift in power wasn't just about taking control of the property. It was about shaping her future, her influence, and how the world would remember her. Victor, who had remained close by since the final legal filings, stood at the doorway, his eyes fixed on the papers before him. "The charitable allocation is in place," he said, his voice as calm as always. "Everything has been processed. Jacob cannot interfere." Eleanor nodded, though she hadn't needed to hear it. She trusted Victor implicitly. He had been the one to make sure that every legal requirement was met, that no cracks remained for anyone to slip through. It was the final safeguard, the last thing Jacob or anyone in her family could claim as their own. The funds were now permanently allocated to causes that would ensure her name lived on, benevolent, yet strategic, charitable, yet influential. Pat, who had been observing the entire process from her spot in the corner, smiled slightly. She had always been the quiet one, the one who observed and knew just when to speak. But today, she couldn't help but show her approval. "I see you've thought of everything," she said, her voice tinged with quiet admiration. "Not only are you securing your legacy, but you're building something that will make it impossible for anyone to undermine you. It's brilliant." Eleanor didn't respond immediately. Instead, she allowed herself to sit back and reflect on what Pat had said. Yes, it was brilliant. But brilliance, as Eleanor knew all too well, came with a price. Her family's entitlement had been a heavy burden, one they had never earned or deserved. It had always been a quiet battle, a battle fought not with words, but with actions. And now, the final move had been made. Outside, the last few guests from the evening began to filter out. There was a shift in their demeanor now, an unspoken recognition that had been absent before. Eleanor's quiet authority had been hard to ignore. The rumors had started, no doubt. The whispers of her cleverness, her strength. They would spread beyond the walls of this house, beyond the family and into the wider world. People would start to take notice, and the whispers would only grow louder. Eleanor felt a calm satisfaction wash over her as she watched the guests file out. It wasn't a victory that needed to be flaunted. The truth of it was already evident in the way they regarded her now. The respect that had been so long denied, now quietly earned. Jacob, who had once stormed out in a fit of humiliation, was nowhere to be seen. He had no choice but to retreat, his defeat final and unspoken. Lauren, though still proud, had lost the confidence she once wore so easily. She couldn't deny the power that had been taken from her, no matter how much she might try to put on a brave face. Nathan, too, was a shadow of the man he had been just days ago. His realization, though painful, was necessary. He had always deferred to others, always let the moment slip through his fingers. But that time was over. Victor stepped forward once again, breaking her thoughts. "Everything is locked down. The charitable allocations have been set up for long-term impact. Everything you wanted is in place." Eleanor stood, meeting his gaze for a brief moment. "Good," she said softly. "Now, we wait. This is just the beginning." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. Pat, who had always been the observer, allowed herself a quiet smile. Eleanor's mastery of the situation had been flawless. The charity wasn't just about doing good. It was about ensuring that her influence, her power, lived on in ways that no one could predict or control. Eleanor's thoughts turned once again to the future. The money, the legacy, the influence. These were all pieces of a larger plan, one that would unfold over time. She had always been patient, and now her patience was paying off. But it wasn't just about legacy, it was about shaping the narrative. The family would soon understand that what they had seen was only a small part of the greater picture she was creating. As the last of the guests left, Eleanor turned back to the window. The quiet peace of the afternoon settled over her once more, but now it felt different. It wasn't the calm of victory. It was the calm before the storm of recognition that would sweep through the city, through the family, and beyond. The world would soon see Eleanor Parker for who she truly was, a woman who had patiently, quietly, taken control of everything she had ever wanted. And when the dust settled, there would be no one left who could ever doubt her power again. It was quiet in the house, the stillness a testament to the quiet triumph that had unfolded over the past weeks. Eleanor sat by the window, watching the city beyond her property slowly come to life as the evening settled in. The subtle hum of traffic, the flicker of lights in the distance. Everything outside seemed to be moving at its own pace, unaware of the monumental shifts that had taken place inside her family's walls. Inside, however, Eleanor could feel the ripple of change. The world was starting to recognize the quiet power she had so carefully built over the years. The whispers of admiration that had begun in her own home were now being carried out into the community. People were talking. The guests who had once been reluctant to give her the respect she deserved were now forced to acknowledge the strategic genius she had displayed. They had seen the game played out in front of them, and now they understood who truly held the reins. Victor had confirmed once again that the protections on the property and the funds remained intact. Eleanor's influence was undeniable. The charitable allocations had been set, ensuring her legacy would live on in ways no one had expected. It wasn't just about giving away money, it was about ensuring that her name, her authority, would resonate far beyond the confines of her family. The land and wealth that had once seemed to belong to others, Jacob, Nathan, Lauren, were now fully and completely in her hands. Pat, who had witnessed everything from the sidelines, stepped into the room quietly, her presence a reminder of the years of quiet support she had given. She had always known how to observe and how to step in when necessary, but today, she didn't need to speak. Eleanor knew that Pat understood the significance of what had just occurred. They had played this game together, carefully, thoughtfully, and now the pieces had all fallen into place. "Well, it's official," Pat said with a knowing smile. "The world is finally seeing you for what you really are. No more pretending." Eleanor nodded, but there was no triumph in her expression, no gloating. She had known this moment would come. It had always been part of the plan. She wasn't seeking recognition. She had never needed it. What mattered now was the control, the influence that had been secured. Jacob's influence, once so powerful and brash, was already diminishing. His name was becoming synonymous with failure. The community, once so eager to place him on a pedestal, had started to whisper about his collapse. The way he had failed to see the bigger picture. The way he had been so blinded by his own entitlement that he had walked right into Eleanor's trap. His reputation, built on arrogance and youth, was crumbling in the light of her calculated, patient rise. Eleanor's lips curved into the faintest of smiles as she thought about Jacob. He had never understood her. He had underestimated her at every turn, and now he would pay the price. He had been the face of the family's entitlement, the one who assumed everything was owed to him. But in the end, it was Eleanor who had outsmarted him. It was she who had shown him what true power really meant. Victor's voice cut through her thoughts, steady as always. "As I've confirmed again, all legal protections are intact. There's no way Jacob or anyone else can challenge the transfers now. The future is secure." Eleanor felt a quiet satisfaction as she heard Victor's words. She had planned for this day long before it arrived. She had known exactly how to position herself, how to prepare for this shift. And now, with the legal structures in place, with the funds securely allocated, there was no way for anyone to interfere. Pat moved closer, her eyes glinting with approval. "You've done it. I knew you would, but still, this is something else." Eleanor's gaze shifted to the stack of papers on the desk, the documents that, once signed, had secured her place. "It's not over yet," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "This is just the beginning. Now I make sure my legacy isn't just remembered, it's respected. I won't let them forget who I am, what I've built." Pat smiled knowingly. "And they won't. People will talk. They always do. Your name will be synonymous with strategy, with precision. They'll be forced to see it." Eleanor allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. It had been decades of patience and planning. Every step, every move had been calculated. The family, in all their entitlement and arrogance, had never known what hit them. They had assumed power was something given, something inherited. But Eleanor had shown them that power was something earned, and earned through strategy, not brute force. As she stood by the window once more, the evening light casting a golden hue across the land she had so carefully protected, Eleanor felt something deeper than satisfaction. She felt a quiet peace. It wasn't about the victory. It wasn't about proving herself to her family, to the world. It was about control. About knowing that her influence would stretch far beyond her years. Her legacy would not only be one of wealth, but of power. Of a woman who had played the long game and had emerged victorious, not just over her family, but over the very idea of entitlement itself. And then, just as she settled back into the peaceful quiet of the room, the doorbell rang. A delivery, perhaps, or another message from a well-wisher. But this time, Eleanor didn't rise immediately. She knew what awaited her. More recognition, more admiration. The world would soon see her for what she truly was. But it wasn't just her family that would remember. It was the world at large, those who had watched and whispered. And as Eleanor turned to face the door, she knew. The recognition had only just begun. And soon they would all understand the full extent of her reach. The afternoon was quiet, a stillness that felt almost sacred. Eleanor sat in her favorite chair, positioned just so by the large bay window, the soft golden light from the sun casting long shadows across the room. The house, which had once echoed with tension, now felt like a sanctuary. Outside, the world hummed along, oblivious to the changes that had unfolded behind these walls. Eleanor couldn't help but smile at the tranquility. It was the kind of peace she had worked so hard to attain, earned through patience, strategy, and quiet determination. For years, her family had dismissed her, assumed her age had dulled her mind and her influence. They had been wrong, and now, as the dust settled, it was clear. They didn't deserve this peace, not the kind that came with true control. The quiet satisfaction Eleanor felt was her own, earned through every calculated move she had made. Jacob was powerless now, no longer able to claim what he thought was his. His arrogance, once so loud and brash, had crumbled under the weight of Eleanor's steady hand. The family's wealth, once within his grasp, was now completely out of reach. The moment he had stormed out of the house, humiliated in front of everyone, had been the final act in a long play of subtle shifts and strategic moves. He no longer held the sway he once did, and the realization that there was nothing left for him to claim had been a bitter pill to swallow. Eleanor took a deep breath, savoring the calm. It had been a long time coming, but she was finally here, secure, unchallenged. The legacy she had built was hers to shape, and now that her enemies had been silenced, she could finally enjoy the fruits of her labor. Pat entered the room quietly, her presence always a comforting one. She had been with Eleanor through it all, observing, supporting, never demanding the spotlight. Pat had always known that the game was long, longer than Jacob, Nathan, or Lauren could ever have understood. She had known that Eleanor's patience would eventually outlast their arrogance. With a small, content smile, Pat approached Eleanor. "Tea?" she asked, a subtle but knowing gleam in her eyes. Eleanor nodded. "Yes, please," she said, her voice soft but filled with quiet satisfaction. There was something grounding about the ritual of tea, something that felt right after so much chaos. She had always enjoyed the quiet moments like this. Pat set the teapot on the table and poured the steaming liquid into two delicate porcelain cups. "You've done it, Eleanor," Pat said, her voice almost reverent. "I knew you would. They never stood a chance." Eleanor didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a slow sip of the tea, letting the warmth wash over her. The peace was what she had earned, and in this moment she could simply enjoy it. Her family, despite their flaws, would never truly understand how they had been outplayed. But it didn't matter now. The lesson had been delivered, and the consequences had been made clear. Victor entered the room just as Pat was setting the teapot down. His presence was always steady, a quiet force behind the scenes, making sure everything remained intact. Eleanor had known he would confirm everything, but hearing it again brought her a sense of closure. "The protections remain permanent," Victor said, his tone firm but calm. "No further challenges can be made. Everything you put in place is secure." Eleanor nodded, her face serene. "Good," she said softly. "Now we can move forward." Pat observed quietly, her eyes glinting with admiration. "Everything's in place, Eleanor. The power is yours, and the world is finally going to see it." Eleanor took another sip of her tea, her thoughts turning to what came next. The charity she had allocated funds to, her legacy, was just the beginning. She had already seen the whispers of her strategic brilliance starting to spread, and in time, the world beyond her family would recognize her for exactly what she had done. This wasn't just about securing the property or defeating Jacob. This was about proving that power, true power, wasn't given. It was earned. It was crafted over time. The doorbell rang, a brief interruption to the stillness. Eleanor, calm as always, didn't flinch. She had expected this. The recognition had begun, and now it would continue to unfold. Guests who had witnessed the shift in her family's dynamics were returning, no doubt with their own ideas of what they had seen. "I'll get it," Pat offered, knowing what was coming. Eleanor didn't respond, her gaze already drifting back to the window. She wasn't concerned with the fleeting recognition. She had long ago understood that power wasn't about the moment. It was about what followed, what would be remembered. Pat returned a few moments later, holding a small package in her hands. "This just arrived for you, Eleanor," she said, her voice tinged with curiosity. Eleanor accepted the package with a knowing smile. "Thank you, Pat," she said, slowly unwrapping the elegant envelope inside. As she opened it, her fingers brushed against the crisp paper. The letter inside was from one of the city's most prestigious magazines, requesting a feature on Eleanor's strategic handling of her property, her management, her foresight, the way she had outsmarted not just her family, but an entire legacy of entitlement. The recognition was no longer just whispered among her family. It was public now. It was official. And soon, it would be known far and wide. Eleanor's lips curled into a small, satisfied smile. This was what she had worked for, what she had sacrificed. This moment, this acknowledgement, it was the final piece of the puzzle, the confirmation of her success. She folded the letter and set it aside, turning back to Pat. "They're starting to see it now," Eleanor said, her voice steady and full of calm satisfaction. "But it's only just begun." Pat smiled, a look of quiet pride in her eyes. "And they'll remember." Eleanor sat back, the weight of her decisions and actions settling comfortably around her. The world would soon recognize her for what she truly was, a woman who had played the long game, who had earned her power, and who now, finally, had everything she had worked for. And as the last of the tea was poured and the evening stretched out before her, Eleanor knew that her legacy had only just begun. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the polished wooden floor, the light filtering softly through the curtains, bathing Eleanor's study in a serene, golden glow. It was the kind of tranquility that she had worked so hard to achieve, a calm that was almost too perfect, too still. It was a peace she had earned, one that had been years in the making. And now, as the final steps of her plan unfolded, Eleanor felt a quiet satisfaction settle over her. The weight of the last few days, of everything that had come before, had finally started to lift. Her family, once so sure of their position, had been stripped of their illusions. Jacob, Nathan, and Lauren each had been forced to confront the cold reality that their entitlement had been nothing more than a fleeting mirage. The power had shifted, irrevocably. Eleanor's influence had grown, solidified, and now there was no question as to who held the reins. But even with the game won, the final move had yet to be made. Eleanor stood at the desk, her fingers lightly grazing the edge of the papers in front of her. The final deed, the document that would confirm her complete control. She had already decided who would take possession of the property. It would be someone who could protect what she had built, someone who would understand the value of what was at stake. This was not just a transfer, it was a statement, a legacy, a lesson. Victor stood across from her, his eyes fixed on the papers as well. His presence, calm and precise, had been a constant through the entire process. He had helped ensure that everything was locked in place, every detail accounted for. Now, his role was almost complete. "Everything is in order," he said, his voice as steady as ever. "The deed is ready for finalization. Jacob's claims are legally null and void." Eleanor nodded, her gaze never wavering from the document. She didn't need to hear it again. She trusted Victor implicitly. She had known that this moment was coming for a long time, the final confirmation that everything was secure. She reached for the pen, the cool metal between her fingers, and in a single, deliberate motion, signed her name. The deed was final. The property, her legacy, was no longer in her family's hands. It had been passed to a trusted party, someone who would protect it for years to come. Victor stepped forward, carefully taking the signed document from her hand. "It's done," he said, his voice carrying a sense of finality. "This is now entirely secure. No one can challenge it. The protections will remain permanent." Eleanor took a slow breath, the weight of his words settling in. It was done. There was no more need for words. The strategy had been executed flawlessly. She had shown her family the true nature of power, the kind that wasn't handed over, but earned, carefully and precisely. Jacob's power, once so certain, had slipped from his grasp. He had mocked her, called her too old to think straight. And now, as he fully comprehended the consequences, he would understand just how wrong he had been. Pat, who had been watching from the doorway, stepped into the room, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. She had always been the quiet observer, the one who had supported Eleanor without asking for anything in return. And now, with everything secured, she could finally celebrate. "You did it," she said, her voice filled with quiet pride. "They never stood a chance." Eleanor turned to her, a faint smile of her own crossing her face. "I never doubted it for a second," she replied softly. She felt the weight of the moment, a moment of complete control. Her enemies had been defeated, her legacy secured, and now the world would begin to see her as she truly was, the architect of her own power, the master of a game they hadn't understood. The doorbell rang again, a sharp reminder that the world beyond her home was moving on, unaware of the final pieces that had just fallen into place. But Eleanor didn't rush. She didn't need to. Her calm authority, her mastery of the situation, was already evident to those who had watched. The whispers of admiration that had started among the guests were now beginning to spread. And as they did, the world would soon know that Eleanor Parker had won, not just in her family's world, but in the world beyond it as well. She walked slowly to the door, her steps measured, deliberate. As she opened it, she saw the last of the guests standing there, waiting to offer their quiet respect, their recognition of her authority. They, too, had seen what had happened. They had seen Jacob's defeat. They had seen the family's illusions shattered. And now they would understand the full extent of Eleanor's power. One of the guests, a former business partner, stepped forward, his expression full of admiration. "I just wanted to say," he began, his voice quiet but filled with respect, "you've handled everything with remarkable grace. No one could have foreseen how things would turn out, but you've outplayed them all." Eleanor nodded, accepting the praise with the same quiet composure that had defined her throughout this entire journey. "Thank you," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But the real work is only just beginning." As the last guest left, Eleanor closed the door behind them, her mind already shifting forward. The game was won, but the legacy was just beginning. She turned back to the room, to Pat and Victor, both standing silently, watching her with admiration. The final deed had been signed, and now it was her time to shine. Jacob had mocked her for being too old to think straight, and now, with everything secured, she could finally show him who was really in charge. He mocked me for being too old. I signed the property to someone who could, and finally, he understood who was in charge.